Good evening, world historians. Today we've reached the Second World War, which of course is one of the big topics of world history. Of course, I'm not going to attempt to summarize the entire scope of that deadliest conflict in the space of this few minutes on YouTube. What I will say, however, if you want to get a better sense of the scale of death and destruction involved, I would recommend the video on YouTube, Fallen of the Second World War, which I have linked to on the Canvas site, but you can just look at that and get a sense of that. So obviously, for most Americans, when does the Second World War begin and when does it end? Obviously, the second question is answered by reference to the first, which is the date which will live in infamy. The 7th of December 1941, the Japanese Imperial Navy attacks the United States at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And as we've seen, American involvement in the Pacific and the tensions which have led up to this attack by Japan, a real sucker punch, but something which, despite its shock value, can probably be traced back at least to the beginnings of confrontation between the US and Japan in the 1850s, which is when you see the American Black Fleet off the coast of Tokyo in 1853. Now, this is, again, when we talk about the Second World War, I'm just going to sum up very briefly. When we talk about this war, we're really talking about a series of overlapping conflicts. We tend to think about Pearl Harbor, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. From the US point of view, perhaps this is more of a sort of Pacific focus. Of course, in Europe, you can go back to September of 1939 and the German invasion of Poland. You can go back further to the German annexation of the Sudetenland region of the Czechoslovakia. But of course, to really understand, we have to go back to the First World War. And before that, we can also look even in the Pacific, even in Asia. You could look at, for example, the Chinese experiencing invasion by Japan in 1937, or even before that, the northern province of Manchuria, which had been invaded by the Japanese in 1931. So actually, when we talk about the Second World War, it's not immediately apparent when it begins, but of course, when it ends with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, becomes very apparent. And this is therefore the beginning, according to most historians, of the Cold War, this ideological conflict which plays out between America and the Soviet Union. The Soviets themselves had played arguably the key role in Europe during World War II, had certainly suffered the most in terms of death and destruction, had driven back the initial invasion of the Third Reich, and by the end of the war had transformed the map of Europe, had occupied Poland, had occupied Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and much of the rest of formerly what had been the Third Reich was now occupied by Joseph Stalin. Europe itself was in ruins, economic chaos, what would become known as spheres of influence between particularly the United States, Washington, and Moscow. The division of Germany, one of many divisions during the Cold War, East versus West, and also in countries such as Greece, especially, to some extent also in places like Turkey, you still saw the fires of the Second World War continuing to burn away some residual effects, and you had elements of the Greek resistance to Germany during World War II. Greece had been invaded by Germany during World War II, but continuing to take arms against their civilian government after the Second World War, because there had been factions which had allied with Moscow and were in the pay, if you like, or at least being supported by Stalin and the Soviet Union. Now, this will lead in 1947 to FDR's successor in the White House, Harry S. Truman, delivering a package before Congress which would become known as the Truman Doctrine. This was a policy statement in 1947 where Truman promised to support free peoples resisting attempted subversion by armed minorities or outside pressures. And by that, he meant the Soviet Union in particular, Joseph Stalin, and the sort of sinister specter of communism, if you like. Now, in 1947, the US government would give some $400 million in assistance to the governments of Greece and Turkey. And so what, you might ask? If you look at the national debt today, I think we're talking more like trillions of dollars rather than millions of dollars. By today's standards, you might say 400 million is like a chunk of change, although I'm sure we'd all be happy to find 400 million tucked away behind our sofa. Nevertheless, in 1947, that $400 million represented sea change in American policy. This was the beginnings of US international aid, not just in a humanitarian sense, but in this case, directed towards political, ideological ends, towards supporting foreign governments in the struggle against communism. And this will become one of the defining characteristics of the Cold War. The other defining characteristic, of course, would be the development and the emergence of the atomic weapons of the atomic age, the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which would be considered relatively small scale compared to some of the megatons of explosion packed away by the hydrogen bombs and other weapons of mass destruction during the Cold War. However, the impact of American weaponry would certainly be a guiding factor in Soviet policy during the Cold War, and the Soviets themselves would get their hands on the atomic bomb by August of 1949, of course, unleashing the atomic age and the shadow of nuclear destruction which lingers with us to this day. So on that comforting thought, I will finish today's YouTube, but I hope you're all keeping well, and I will be in touch very shortly. Thanks very much.